For years, I had felt invisible in my own family, like a ghost at every holiday, every birthday, every casual family gathering, and Thanksgiving had always been the most painful reminder of my place, or lack thereof. My parents, my sisters, even my cousins, always including everyone except me, and I had spent countless hours staring at social media feeds on Thanksgiving Day, scrolling through photos of elaborate dinners, smiling faces, and the laughter that I had been denied, while I sat alone in my apartment nursing the same bitter resentment that had been building for decades, wondering what I had done to deserve such consistent exclusion. Until one year, after a promotion at work had finally given me a sense of independence and pride, I decided to let the family continue their charade while I focused on myself, decorating my apartment with fall-themed pumpkins and candles, ordering food for myself, and even calling a few friends to make sure that the day had warmth. And yet, even as I tried to ignore it, a part of me still ached, still longed for acknowledgement, still hoped that someone, anyone, would notice me. And that was when the call came from my sister Anna's husband, Rob, who I had always thought of as the more decent one in the family, polite, measured, calm, and he asked if I could meet him at my office. And I immediately knew something was off, because Rob never called me directly, and the tone of his voice was unusually serious, strained even. And he said, "I need to see you, it's important." And against my better judgment, I agreed, feeling a mix of curiosity, fear, and old resentment, not realizing that my life, as I had known it, was about to pivot in ways I hadn't imagined, that his visit would open a series of revelations. And as he walked into my office a few days later, impeccably dressed, calm but tense, I immediately noticed the briefcase in his hand, the way he avoided my eyes for a moment, then caught my gaze with a mixture of guilt and urgency. And I gestured for him to sit, my heart pounding, my mind racing with all the scenarios I had imagined over the years. And he began, "You weren't invited to Thanksgiving because of things that happened long ago, things your family never told you, and I think you deserve to know." And the words hit me like a lightning bolt, because the truth was always something I had sensed, a silent undercurrent of exclusion that had defined my childhood and young adulthood. And as he opened his briefcase, pulled out a stack of envelopes and photographs, and began showing me details of financial decisions, family meetings, and letters I had never received, I realized that my parents had systematically excluded me, not just socially, but financially and emotionally, and that my exclusion was calculated, intentional, and long-term, designed to maintain appearances while keeping me at a distance. And as I looked at the documents, I discovered that my inheritance had been manipulated. My father had left provisions that were deliberately withheld from me. My parents had conspired with Anna to ensure that I remained the overlooked child, the invisible daughter, while all praise, attention, and resources flowed to her. And Rob explained that he had grown uneasy about this after observing Anna's increasingly entitled behavior, her obsession with control, and her cruelty masked as family tradition. And that's why he was now secretly giving me evidence, warning me, and suggesting that the family's pattern could be exposed, leveraged, and corrected. And I listened in stunned silence, absorbing decades of betrayal in mere moments, a mix of anger, sadness, and a cold resolve forming in me, as I realized that my years of neglect, humiliation, and invisibility had given me strength, and that strength could now be turned into justice. And as Rob continued, he revealed that Anna had also mismanaged family trusts, attempted to liquidate properties in my name without my knowledge, and had been responsible for blocking my access to important family accounts. and I felt a wave of vindication, realizing that all those times I had been dismissed, underestimated, or ignored were not merely accidental or due to parental favoritism, but part of a much larger malicious plan. And that realization lit a fire in me, a plan forming in my mind for how I would reclaim not just my rightful place, but the respect and acknowledgement my family had denied me for decades. And for the first time in my life, I felt in control, empowered to flip the script. And Rob, sensing my determination, quietly said, "I can help, but you have to be careful. One misstep and they will gaslight, manipulate, and attack you to protect their image." And I nodded, understanding the stakes, knowing that this was more than revenge. It was a reclamation of my life and dignity. And over the next few days, I meticulously planned my next steps, reviewing the documents Rob had provided, cross-referencing dates, phone calls, and financial records, piecing together a timeline that revealed every instance of favoritism, deceit, and manipulation. And I started recording interactions, gathering evidence, and building a strategy that would not only expose Anna, but protect me from any gaslighting or retaliation. And Thanksgiving arrived with its usual pomp and self-congratulatory atmosphere at my parents' home, with tables overflowing with food, laughter, and smiles plastered over long-held resentment and lies. And I stayed home, my apartment now transformed into a warm, serene environment that I had intentionally crafted to contrast with the chaos my family created. And as the evening progressed, I received a text from Rob that said, "It's time," and I understood that my plan, carefully timed, had reached the critical moment, and I began preparing the surprise, using the evidence and documents I had compiled to expose decades of injustice, to reclaim my narrative, and to teach my family a lesson they would never forget. And when Anna's husband arrived at my apartment casually and seemingly innocent, he rang the doorbell, and I opened the door to find him standing there, holding an envelope that looked innocuous, but inside it contained carefully arranged documents, letters, and financial statements that, when revealed to Anna and the family, would leave them speechless, unable to deny, twist, or manipulate. And as I watched Rob hand me the envelope, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction, anxiety, and anticipation, knowing that in a matter of hours, the hidden truths of my family would explode in a way that would finally give me the recognition and justice I had been denied. And I began planning exactly how to reveal everything, from emails, financial records, social evidence, to hidden conversations and letters, all orchestrated in a manner that would protect me legally while ensuring maximum impact. And as I sat down at my laptop, drafting emails and messages for the big reveal, I realized that all those years of neglect, ridicule, and invisibility had forged in me a patience, a strategy, and an understanding of human behavior that Anna and my parents could never match. And I smiled because for the first time, I wasn't powerless. I was the one holding the strings, and this Thanksgiving would be remembered not for what they had tried to hide, but for what I would expose. And for the first time, the ignored daughter had the upper hand, and the revenge was not cruel, it was perfectly justified, and the satisfaction of knowing the truth would come out, that justice would finally be served, filled me with a warmth far greater than any holiday feast could have offered. And I spent the rest of the evening organizing my evidence, rehearsing the timing, imagining Anna's face when each carefully prepared piece fell into place, and knowing that the next day, when I initiated the reveal, my family would finally understand that neglecting, underestimating, and mocking me for years had consequences, that the invisible daughter had grown into a woman capable of outsmarting them, taking control, and ensuring that all those years of favoritism, cruelty, and dismissal would be seen for what they were. And I felt an almost surreal sense of empowerment as I planned my first email, addressed to my parents and sisters with copies to key family friends, and I realized this was not about money, though the inheritance and assets were a factor. It was about respect, recognition, and truth, about showing them that the person they tried to suppress, ignore, and humiliate could not only survive but thrive, exposing their lies and manipulations to everyone who mattered. And as the night deepened, I reviewed every word, every document, every photograph, every proof I had painstakingly collected, ensuring that my story would be undeniable and that my family could no longer pretend that my exclusion had been trivial or insignificant. And as I closed my laptop, I felt the calm before the storm, knowing that tomorrow Thanksgiving would never be the same, and neither would my family's perception of me, because for the first time in decades, I was in control of the narrative, ready to reveal the truth, and ready to step into the place I had always deserved. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke with a sense of calm determination, a feeling I had never experienced in relation to my family before. Instead of the usual bitterness or sadness, I felt focus, clarity, and a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing the game had finally shifted in my favor. And the first step in my plan was simple yet devastating. I drafted an email to my parents, my sisters, and their spouses, carefully attaching the documents Rob had given me: photographs, bank statements, letters, and screenshots of conversations that clearly illustrated decades of exclusion, manipulation, and favoritism. And I spent hours writing the cover letter, crafting each sentence to be polite yet precise, factual yet undeniable, knowing that once sent, there would be no room for them to gaslight, deny, or deflect. It was a cold and calculated strategy, one I had honed in my career as a financial analyst, a skill set I had learned to wield not just in business, but now in family warfare. And as I hit send, I felt a thrill unlike any I had felt before, a combination of empowerment, justice, and the anticipation of the reaction I knew was coming. And within minutes, my phone began buzzing with notifications, emails bouncing back, read receipts, and messages from both my parents and my sisters, each one more panicked, more defensive, more frantic than the last. And I resisted the urge to respond immediately, knowing that any engagement at this point would only give them the opportunity to spin or excuse their behavior. Because my plan was not to argue, it was to reveal the truth, let it speak for itself, and watch them crumble under the weight of their own deceit. And as the hours passed, I began receiving phone calls, starting with my mother, whose voice trembled as she said, "Emily, what is all this?" And I calmly explained, without anger, that it was all evidence she and Anna had refused to share with me over the years, that the exclusions, the favoritism, and the manipulations were documented, undeniable, and that I had taken the time to organize them precisely so that no one could dismiss the facts. And her sobs filled the line, a mixture of fear, guilt, and helplessness, as she realized that her carefully maintained facade was collapsing. And soon after, Anna called, her voice sharp and defensive, attempting to claim innocence. But I let her talk, silently recording the conversation, knowing that every word would add to the proof that I had meticulously gathered. And as she raised her voice, blaming circumstances and claiming misunderstandings, I could hear the frustration and panic in her tone, the cracks in the armor she had worn for decades. And that feeling of power, that understanding that I was no longer powerless, surged through me like electricity as I realized that this was not just a personal victory, it was a reclamation of every year of my life that had been spent feeling invisible and undervalued. And then the most delicious part of all unfolded. My father called, cautiously at first, but with a tone that betrayed a mixture of pride and fear, saying, "Emily, I knew you'd discover the truth eventually, and you've handled it with more composure than I could have expected." And I felt a strange warmth hearing his words, knowing that even though he had allowed the exclusions and manipulations to continue, he recognized the strength I had developed, the intelligence I had applied, and the justice I had now orchestrated. And as the day progressed, the family group chat, once full of casual jokes, news, and small talk, erupted into chaos, with everyone reacting to the evidence, with Anna frantically typing messages, only to have my parents contradict her, their attempts at damage control failing spectacularly. And within hours, several family friends and cousins contacted me privately, expressing shock, sympathy, and admiration for the way I had handled decades of neglect. And it was in that moment I realized just how much power I had gained, not just in terms of material inheritance or acknowledgement, but in terms of narrative control, influence, and reputation. And I began planning the next stage, ensuring that Anna could not manipulate, lie, or retaliate further. And I involved Rob once again, coordinating the release of more evidence, timing conversations, and strategically sharing information with key family members and legal counsel to maximize accountability. And the more Anna tried to spin, the more her efforts backfired, because the facts were structured so that any attempt to deflect or gaslight would only reinforce the truth. And that evening, my sister, usually so composed, called my office, something she had never dared to do before, screaming that I had ruined the family, that I had betrayed her trust, that I had humiliated her in front of everyone. And I calmly reminded her that the documents, the records, and the evidence spoke for themselves, that it was not I who had built a web of exclusion, favoritism, and manipulation, it was she, and the lies could no longer stand. And when she realized that her words only proved my point further, the line went silent, and I finally allowed myself to exhale, feeling a sense of justice and relief that I had never known before. And in the days that followed, I continued to carefully manage communication, ensuring that any attempts to interfere, intimidate, or coerce me were documented and neutralized, while simultaneously reconnecting with parts of my family who had also been marginalized or excluded, forming alliances, sharing truths, and finally creating a support system that I had never had. And as Thanksgiving faded into history, I realized that the day had not been about a meal, a party, or even resentment. It had been about empowerment, reclaiming my voice, and exposing the truth. And the ultimate payoff came when Anna, in a moment of rage and desperation, tried to contest a minor portion of the family estate, only to have all her manipulations, previous deceit, and recorded interactions presented to the family lawyer and judge, resulting in her losing not just her claim, but having to compensate for mismanaged funds. And as I watched her reaction, a mixture of fury, humiliation, and disbelief, I finally felt the sweet satisfaction of justice served, without cruelty, without malice, simply by allowing truth, evidence, and patience to do their work. And the lessons I took from this were profound, that power lies not in aggression but in preparation, not in anger but in strategy, not in revenge but in reclaiming one's own narrative. And as the days turned into weeks, I focused on rebuilding relationships with those who had supported me quietly over the years, reconnecting with cousins, distant relatives, and friends who all now recognized my worth and strength. And I began organizing family gatherings of my own, not to flaunt power, but to establish fairness, respect, and acknowledgement. And for the first time in decades, Thanksgiving became a symbol not of exclusion, but of triumph, resilience, and reclaimed dignity. And in the quiet moments, I reflected on how far I had come, from a girl ignored, overlooked, and invisible, to a woman who had not only exposed deception and manipulation, but also redefined her place in the family, asserting her value, her intelligence, and her right to recognition. And as I sat in my office one evening reviewing the final pieces of evidence, emails, and confirmations that had brought closure to a lifetime of neglect, I realized that the revenge I had orchestrated was not just about proving Anna wrong or punishing my family, but about affirming my own worth, setting boundaries, and finally living a life where I was seen, heard, and respected. And in the weeks that followed, I carefully documented every interaction, formalizing the lessons I had learned into a personal guide for handling toxic family dynamics, a roadmap for others who had suffered invisibility and neglect. And as I prepared to share some of these lessons online to help others, I knew with certainty that my story, my journey from ignored child to empowered adult, would resonate, inspire, and serve as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope, showing that even the most entrenched family manipulation and cruelty could be overcome with strategy, patience, and courage, and that in the end, the invisible child could not only be seen, but celebrated, and the once dominant sister could be exposed, humbled, and held accountable. And as I closed my laptop and looked out at the city lights, I finally felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that my Thanksgiving, the one day that had always symbolized exclusion, had been transformed into a story of justice, empowerment, and victory that would never be